10 after 9 o'clock. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back. This is News and Views on Salam Media, and a big welcome to our Polokwane listeners on One Nation FM. Coming up in this hour, we are going to be talking with Nontobeko Aisha Makwanazi. She is a journalist at Muslim Views newspaper, and she is our woman in media today. We obviously accolade this amazing young woman. Also on the show, Rahma Carr, Regional Sales Manager in the Western Cape for Al Baraka Bank. She's going to be talking to us about the Al Baraka Women in Business Networking Forum and the event that's going to be taking place this month in honor of Women's Month. But first up, another amazing, powerful woman. She is Thato Masiangoako. I do hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She is from the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. A very good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Julian. Good morning to your viewers.
I trust I pronounced your name correctly.
You did a fairly good job. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to be discussing something pretty serious and pretty heart-wrenching as well. It's 11 years since the Marikana massacre, and I guess the big question is, can the state do more to further redress victims of the Marikana massacre and its aftermath? We're hearing that 11 years later, the situation of the victims of Marikana and their families, the situation and their living conditions haven't changed much at all. Is that in fact true?
So Marikana, the place, my understanding is the situation there is quite dire in terms of, socioeconomic amenities and the like. But I think your question about whether or not the state can do more is an important one, because from our perspective, the state has barely done enough. When the family submitted their civil claim to the state in 2015, in that claim, they included 5 pleas. And one was for an apology. They're yet to receive a formal, dignified apology directly to them as the families. No one from the state has gone to visit them directly and to grieve with them, in a sense. The other claim was a claim for loss of support. That would have been what the families would have received from their loved one who would have been working in the mine. The other 3 claims are for medical damages, constitutional damages, and then general damages. The state has only made offers that have been settled on for 34 families only for loss of support. So that is what someone would have made while working in the mine. So that was calculated by an actuary, and they settled for 34 families. But we represent 36 families. The 35th family, there is an offer that has been made, and the settlement is in the process of being finalized. But the state has refused to compensate the 36th family because they feel that he did not have a duty to support his siblings and his siblings' children. Even though he became the breadwinner in his family soon after his parents passed away while he was young.
How careless of the state when you look at the wastage by government officials, when you look at all of the corruption that goes on, when you look at Lonmin as a whole, we know they are making billions in profits, and they can't see 36 families right. It's going to be an absolute drop in the ocean as far as either they or the government is concerned regarding the settlement. And to add insult to injury, nobody has been criminally convicted. We know you've just told us that the families haven't been fully compensated for the loss of their loved ones. The police and other officials involved have not accounted for their actions despite the findings and recommendations of the Farnham Commission of Inquiry that sat for over 2 years and cost more than 150 million rands. That is actually quite shameful, isn't it? That the commission cost that amount of money, and these poor families, I mean, just try and break down that 150 million rand. That was what the commission was paid, if that was divided amongst those families, we wouldn't be sitting and talking about this very sorry state of affairs now.
No, and you know what? While there are various shortcomings of the commission, one of them being, that they didn't really allow the families to share their views. In fact, it was only after we had to ask the commissioner to hear from the families were they given like very limited time in the commission to share victim impact statements. But what the commission was helpful in revealing was a lot of the dishonesty that had gone on the part of the police immediately after the massacre. But I'm glad that you raised the issue of prosecutions, because that is really probably one of the key demands that the families have had. 9 police officers only were charged at all. 4 stood trial for related to the circumstances around the death of one of the miners. It was found that the police had lied under oath during the commission of inquiry. IPA did their own investigation and found that out. And so they were standing trial for concealing the circumstances around that miner's death. Unfortunately, they were acquitted. But there are still 6 officers who are standing trial for what happened on the 13th of August when 3 mine workers and 2 police officers were killed. That trial has been sitting for about 2 years now. And, we don't know when the end to that will come. But we're yet to have any prosecutions for what happened on the 16th. No politician, no senior SAPS officer, no one from the mine, no one has been charged for what happened on the 16th. And yet we know that the state ordered rounds of ammunition in order for their preparations to fall into place for what happened on the 16th of August. We know that mortuary vans were ordered. There's so many people that are involved in the decision making beyond the police officers who ultimately were the ones pulling the triggers. But we've seen no accountability on that front. And the families just want to know what happened to their loved ones and why they had to be killed in such a manner. And so that is really the key demand. It is shameful that we're sitting 11 years later with no answers or any kind of clarity in terms of that.
As you speak now, Thato, what comes to mind for me is the TRC. And I'm thinking that these families needed something like that, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee in some form or the other. And the fact that they were not allowed to share their views, the families at the inquest or
yeah.
the hearing, they were not allowed to share their views fully. Rob them of a grieving process per se, because had they shared what they had gone through at that time, it would have been part of the grieving and healing, would it not?
It certainly would have. And I must say, they were ultimately allowed to share their views, but, nothing like the amount of time that was spent on any other aspect of the commission. So it was limited. And it did help a lot of the widows in moving their grieving process along. But all of them will tell you, if you have the opportunity to ever speak to them, they've never had full acknowledgement from the state. They've never had a full apology. So even if you on your own embark on your own kind of closure, on your own journey to receive some kind of healing, that's partly hampered by the fact that whoever is responsible or whoever the perpetrator is yet to acknowledge what's happened to you. And that forms part of any kind of reconciliatory or a justice process that would lead to some kind of reconciliation. So there has to be some kind of contrition. There has to be some kind of honesty about what happened. And as you bring up the TRC, that was one of the preconditions for receiving amnesty. Of course, there's debate around whether or not that should have been the way to do it. But the point is, you needed to have been truthful about what you did, and you needed to have shown some kind of remorse. The state has promised to apologize. They've said all kinds of things about Marikana. They don't always call it a massacre, as far as we understand. They refer to it as some kind of a tragedy, which speaks to this point that they don't really want to acknowledge any kind of fault in what happened, even though the murder of 17 miners at scene 1 and a further 17 miners at scene 2 has all been revealed And we saw that on our own televisions. And yet the state has been able to sort of hope and wish that it would disappear.
I remember speaking with one of the widows on this very show a couple of months ago. It was actually the anniversary of the Marikana massacre, so to speak. She's one of the fortunate ones that's been partially, and I say partially compensated because you can never be fully compensated for life of
Yes,
loss and everything else and all the trauma that you've been through that you're going to live with for the rest of your life. And
yes.
she said to me, I asked her on the show, what will it take for you to get closure on this entire situation and for you to move on with your life? And she said to me, for me, closure would mean for Cyril Ramaphosa to meet with me personally and to apologize to me.
Mhm,
And we kind of a year ago thought that that would
mhm.
happen. Till today, the woman has not received her closure. Is that too much to ask?
Absolutely not. The president promised to go to the widows, I think, once in a State of a Nation address, and then he repeated that promise at Winnie Mandela's funeral. The families continue to wait. They really just want someone to to see them and connect with them, and really sympathize and empathize with them for what they lost. Losing a loved one is a terrible thing. I think we can all agree on that. But to lose a loved one in the manner that they lost loved ones, I mean, there are families, of these families, who suffered multiple losses. One family, at the news that a loved one was killed, died instantly. One of the widows was pregnant. I think she was very far along in her pregnancy. She miscarried. There are children that have committed suicide as a result of what's followed. And I think a lot of that just stems from a failure on the part of the state to really take control of this situation and to really empathize with people for what they've suffered. Um, and they all say that. I'm glad that you shared that account, because they want some kind of acknowledgement. They want people who are responsible to be able to account for their actions. And so many of the families, even if it's not their loved ones for whom the police are currently standing trial in Mahikeng, but they attend those trials not only as an act of solidarity with all the family members, but because for them it is an opportunity for them to hear from the police what was happening. Where were you getting instructions? Why did you act this way? What did you experience? And how is it that our loved ones were mowed down in the manner that they were? So understanding the circumstances of the death are also part of the healing process. But I think for the broader public, what we also have to remember is, many of those police officers who were at Marikana, some of them may have killed people in cold blood. And I'm speaking specifically about scene two. Some of those police officers, who knows, they may still be on the police force. Those are the kind of police who are currently roaming the streets and currently tasked with upholding law and order. People who killed people in cold blood. I think the risk of leaving Marikana unaddressed for so long is something that I think we've seen in many incidents where the police are just overzealous in their use of force. And while they say that they've learned from Marikana, and maybe we won't see the same level of killings on that same scale, we still see people losing their lives in protests on a regular basis. We still see the police responding to people in a very forceful and violent manner. So, for the families, it's a difficulty for them to kind of reckon with what's happened to them because of how the state has deliberately dragged its feet. But for the rest of the public, a police force that does not fully demonstrate their acknowledgement and implementation of what they've learned from Marikana, it will always be at risk of that kind of policing. The circumstances may be different, but we'll always see a police force that will use force against people in a very cruel manner.
What is also very sad about the Marikana massacre is because these families haven't yet received closure in some form or the other, like the widow I spoke to last year. She just wants closure by a meeting with the president. And it probably is different for different families. But just look at the situation of the the generational, intergenerational trauma. This is going to be passed down to their children and their children's children. And we need to really stop it in its tracks. And it's not only those 36 families, it's the entire community of Marikana, because it's a small community. They interact all the time, they intermarry in the community, within the community, and that community just grows. So, can you just imagine what that's going to, play out in future generations? It is so important that closure happens for these people, that government hears them, that government meets with them, and government finally puts this matter to rest. This is going to remain and ease a fresh wound in the lives of the victims and their families, because they have yet to see justice in the form of criminal convictions, sufficient compensation for their loss and suffering, and of course, an apology from the state, as I've said, in particular from President Ramaphosa for his role in the massacre.
No, definitely. Many of the children who lost their parents in 2012 are adults now, and for them, they've sort of had to reckon with what that means, what that trauma means for them, what it means to have lost a parent in that way, and what it's robbed them of in their childhood, and to reconcile that with a government that they will have to interact with as they grow into adults. So it is absolutely an intergenerational thing that that does need to be addressed. And the longer it is left, it's sort of like a wound that continues to fester. I also just want to draw attention to the role of the mine, because they are just as part of the story as the state
Absolutely.
is. And, Lonmin was acquired by Sibanye Stillwaters. And as you mentioned, the mines in this country make billions and billions of rands on an annual basis. And when Lonmin was acquired, I believe, the CEO of Sibanye, now Neil Froneman, spoke to the families and basically expressed their commitment to wanting to facilitate their healing and their access to closure. But their relationship with the mine continues to be quite a fraught one. The mine has taken on the responsibility since Lonmin to educate all of the children, and they have done so. But there are a number of other elements in their relationship that have just not been as smooth or as smooth as we would hope. And our plea to the mine, of course, is that they, in their approach to facilitating justice, they allow themselves to be led by the victims who have suffered the harm that they have. There have been proposals that the families have made to the mine, which the mine just isn't prepared to entertain. But at the same time, it is running a Marikana renewal project, we understand. And what we're appealing for is for that project and that process to be led and driven by the needs and perspectives of the victims, and not allow it to become some kind of a whitewashing project that sort of absolves the responsibility of the mine and absolves it of any kind of culpability. Because ultimately, at the core of Marikana, what happened in 2012 was, laborers seeking to address their wage dispute directly with their employer, and their need for their housing and working conditions to be improved. Those were all very legitimate concerns, and what they did was refuse to allow their grievances to be taken up by the union because they were no longer satisfied with that form of representation. And so they wanted to engage directly with their employer. Many of us are employed in spaces where we can engage directly with our employers, right? But they were, the mine, at the time that the miners expressed their grievances, the mine simply flat out refused to ever engage them directly. And, the miners had, nominated a few of them to lead that delegation, but the mine just refused. And from our perspective, that refusal is what led to the 16th of August ultimately. There are a series of events that take place from the 10th, when the miners decide to go on strike, up until the 16th. But ultimately, the mine refusing to engage directly with their employers is really what got us here. And so that raises a range of issues about how politics happens in this country, how labor disputes are addressed, particularly in the context of the mining industry, where there's such a long history of exploitation of labor. So, if the mine had not chosen instead to put the state between it and its employees, maybe we'd have a different situation today. Now, of course, their concern might have been the implications of what kind of precedent that would set, but ultimately, the miners had occupied Okopi, the hill where they were. They were not on any kind of strategic spot. They were using that occupation as leverage, and the mine simply refused. They never, ever, ever wanted to go and speak to them. All the while, the leaders of the unions, we've seen all that footage where the leaders of the union are more prepared to go and speak directly to the miners, almost as if they were animals they could not be engaged with, that the mine refused to engage them. But there was a refusal on the part of the mine and the mining bosses to go and speak to employees who simply were demanding a living wage, not just a wage that complies with the minimum wage, but a living wage. If you factor in the fact that they live in places where there are no access to various amenities like safe water, access to electricity, sanitation, good roads, schools, healthcare. Those are a range of things that all of us deserve in this country and are enshrined in the Constitution to varying levels. But we sort of allow poor people in various parts of this country to sort of just get by with whatever they can. And then we get surprised when there are riots or there are protests that just spill over. And I think that speaks to just our acceptance or even indifference to that level of suffering.
Sadly so. I'm just kind of wondering, 11 years on, can we expect a different result? And I'm thinking, you representing Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, you're a strong body in your own right. And 11 years later, you're still talking about the same injustice for the people of Marikana. What more needs to be done to make the mine bosses aware and wake up to this reality, and also government to come on board and for once and for all address this matter, so that the people of Marikana can get closure on this very, very disastrous, sad and traumatic event, in their lives going back 11 years. Who else needs to to get involved to make their voices heard, and heard so very loudly that action can be, put in place?
Thank you for that question. I think we must never underestimate the role that the public has to play. You, me, you're in the media, I work at SERI, but members of the public in any space that they find themselves need to not forget that Marikana happened, and to express that that outrage, because it is outrageous. I think for the mine, we really do rely on the state to hold up its end of the bargain in holding mining companies to account. And unfortunately, the difficulty is, if the state is dragging its own feet on facilitating justice, I suppose it finds itself in a tricky position in trying to hold the mine accountable for its part. So both of them don't want to be held accountable, but we cannot allow the state to forget about Marikana. And to be honest, the fact that we continue to commemorate Marikana with the absence of the state, I must just make that very clear. The state does not really acknowledge Marikana at all. It's the media that's done a fantastic job. It's civil society that's done a fantastic job. It's the people and the families that were affected by Marikana that have done the hard work of keeping Marikana at the forefront of our minds. But the rest of the public can do its part by always expressing their outrage, and insisting that our government act and do right by these families. There has been somewhat of a global campaign to continue to support the families and the victims of the massacre. And I suppose that that is something that we need to really tap into as well. Mines are connected to the global market, and so I guess that is an opportunity to perhaps apply some kind of pressure. But ultimately, the state really does have to come to the party. It needs to come to the party in the form of, expediting prosecutions, and it needs to come to the party in settling the civil claims. It cannot drag on for much longer than this. And finally, it just has to, come to the table and apologize, just humble itself and apologize for what happened, which we all recognize was a terrible injustice.
11 years on since the Marikana massacre, lest we forget. It seems as if the state has forgotten. And of course, we do expect the state to do more to redress the victims of the Marikana massacre after its traumatic aftermath. All I can say to you, Thato, from SERI, keep up the great work. Keep your eyes on this matter, and till justice is done, please God, till justice is done, and all
Yes.
other amazing work that you guys undertake. Lovely talking with you. God bless, and you go well.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks a lot.
It is exactly 9:36 news and views right here on Salam Media. And as the show progresses, we are now going to talk to Rahma Kar. She is the regional sales manager in the Western Cape for Al Baraka Bank. So don't go away. I think she's going to be sharing some wonderful information with us regarding Women's Month. So stay with me.